The mountain does not care about your rank or your training or the family waiting for you back home in the valley. On Whiteface Mountain, in the jagged heart of the Adirondacks, the wind has a way of stripping away the ego of even the toughest and most seasoned men. The air was a razor that February afternoon in the year 2018. Thin and freezing and heavy, with the scent of ancient pine and the metallic tang of impending storms. It was the kind of bone-deep cold that settled in the marrow, making the entire world feel fragile and sharp and ready to shatter at the slightest touch. He was a firefighter, a man built for the chaos of the front lines and trained to handle the unexpected with a calm and steady hand. There were several of them up there on that ridge, a tight brotherhood of men who thought they knew the terrain and their own physical limits. They were laughing and joking in the warmth of the ski lodge, surrounded by the comforting smell of seasoned wood smoke and the low mechanical hum of distant lifts. It was supposed to be a simple and restorative trip, a brief break from the screaming sirens and the choking smoke of the city streets. The sun was beginning its slow and bloody descent behind the jagged peaks of the range, casting long and distorted shadows across the packed and wind-swept snow. He told his friends he needed to run down to the parking lot for just a moment. Just a quick and mundane trip to grab a phone, or perhaps a camera from his vehicle. He stepped out of the golden warmth of the lodge and into the biting and hungry mouth of the mountain air. The heavy door clicked shut behind him with a finality he could not have imagined. And the absolute silence of the high wilderness rushed in to meet him like a rising tide. The parking lot was a vast and desolate sea of white and grey, the scattered vehicles looking like huddling and frozen beasts in the rapidly fading light. He walked toward his own car, his heavy ski boots crunching rhythmically and loudly against the frozen crust of the ancient earth. Every breath he took was a thick cloud of silver vapor that hung in the stagnant air before vanishing into the dark wall of the trees. He felt the immense weight of the forest pressing against the edges of the asphalt, a dark and watchful presence that never truly sleeps and never truly welcomes the living. Then, without warning or sound, the world simply tilted on its axis. There was no sudden sound of a struggle and no desperate cry for help that echoed through the swaying pines. He reached out his hand for the cold metal handle of the vehicle, but the familiar and solid grip of reality began to slip through his fingers like dry and burning sand. One moment, he was a man on a simple mission in a familiar place, and the next, he was a ghost in the making, drifting away from the world of men. The mountain took him into its deep and velvet shadow without leaving so much as a single scuff mark or a disturbed flake in the fresh snow. When he did not return within the hour, the easy laughter in the warm lodge began to sour into a sharp and metallic kind of dread. His friends stepped outside into the biting cold, calling his name into the gathering dark, but receiving only the hollow and mocking whistle of the wind in return. They searched the car and they searched the immediate perimeter of the lot, their flashlights cutting weak and flickering yellow holes in the vast and hungry night. There was nothing to find. No tracks leading away into the brush and no sign of a fall or a medical emergency. He had simply ceased to exist in the space between the lodge and the car. By the early light of the next morning, the full and heavy weight of the state was descending upon the slopes of Whiteface Mountain. Hundreds of searchers moved in a slow and agonizingly deliberate grid, their eyes scanning every inch of the white landscape for a flash of color or a break in the frozen brush. State police and forest rangers worked side by side, their faces hardened by the brutal cold and the growing sense of impossibility. Helicopters buzzed overhead like angry and persistent insects, their sophisticated thermal cameras peering through the dense canopy in search of a heat signature that was not there. The Adirondacks felt cold and utterly indifferent to the frantic and puny energy of the humans below. The missing 411 cases often start in this exact manner, with a disappearance that defies the physical laws of the natural environment. Highly trained tracking dogs could not pick up a single scent on the frozen and unyielding ground, as if he had simply evaporated into the thin and crystalline mountain air. The searchers pushed through waist-deep drifts of snow and battled sudden whiteout conditions that turned the world into a blinding and directionless void. They looked in deep crevices, and they looked in the darkest stands of timber. But the firefighter was nowhere to be found in the physical world they occupied. The nights were the absolute worst for those waiting back at the makeshift base camp in the valley. The temperature plummeted deep into the negatives, and the wind roared like a wounded and prehistoric animal through the narrow mountain passes. They knew with a sickening certainty that no human could survive for long in those conditions without proper shelter or a fire. Yet, they kept searching through the frostbite and the exhaustion, driven by a flickering hope that was rapidly being replaced by a chilling and heavy certainty. The mountain was holding onto its secret with a grip of iron and ancient ice. There is a strange and documented quality to the silence in these high and isolated places, a heavy and unnatural quiet that searchers often describe with a shudder as the Oz effect. It is as if the birds and the insects and even the wind suddenly vanish, and the very air becomes thick and heavy with a strange static charge. Some veteran investigators believe that the geography itself folds in on itself in these moments, creating hidden pockets where time and space do not behave as they should. He had stepped into one of those hidden folds, and the world had closed tight behind him like a healing wound. While the searchers were freezing and losing hope in New York, something entirely impossible was happening on the other side of the vast continent. 6 long days had passed since he walked toward his car in the snowy Adirondacks. 6 days of total silence and absolute darkness, and a void in the historical record that no one could explain or justify. The transition for him was not a journey across the land, but a sudden and violent re-entry into a reality he no longer recognized or understood. He opened his eyes, and the very first thing he felt was the sun. A warm and punishing heat that felt alien and wrong against his pale and frozen skin. He was standing on a hard concrete sidewalk in the city of Sacramento, California. The chaotic sound of rushing traffic and the heavy smell of exhaust replaced the scent of pine and the sharp bite of the mountain frost. He was nearly 3,000 miles away from the spot where he had last stood, and he had absolutely no idea how he had crossed the great distance of a nation. He was still wearing his bright yellow ski jacket and his heavy, insulated snow pants that were designed for the peaks. His heavy ski boots clattered and echoed on the warm pavement as he wandered in a daze through the busy streets of the city. Most bizarre of all, he was still wearing his thick ski helmet, and his goggles were pushed up on his forehead as if he had just stepped off a lift. To the people passing by in their summer clothes, he looked like a man who had fallen directly out of the sky or stepped out of a vivid and terrifying dream. He was profoundly confused and dangerously dehydrated, his eyes darting around at the unfamiliar glass buildings and the palm trees that swayed in the warm Pacific breeze. When he finally found a public phone and called his wife, his voice was a ragged and broken whisper of pure disbelief. He told her he was in California, and for a long and agonizing moment, there was only the sound of static and desperate tears on the other end of the line. No one could begin to understand how a man could vanish in the deep snow and reappear in the burning sun within a single week. The details that emerged in the following days were even more unsettling and jagged than the distance itself. When authorities finally sat him down in an interrogation room, they noticed things that did not make sense for a man who had been lost in the wilderness for a week. His hair had been neatly and professionally trimmed, as if he had sat calmly in a barber chair during his missing time. He was also carrying a brand new and expensive iPhone, a device he did not own and had never seen when he went to his car in New York. He had no memory of buying the phone or sitting for a haircut, or how he had managed to travel across the entire expanse of the United States. He spoke to investigators of vague and fragmented flashes, of riding in the back of a large and darkened truck and feeling a constant sense of forward movement. But there were no bus tickets and no credit card charges and no witnesses who saw a man in full ski gear on a bus or a plane. He was a man who had been moved across the map by a force that left no paper trail and no digital footprint. Medical professionals and neurologists examined him for days for any signs of a stroke or a sudden psychotic break. But his brain showed no evidence of trauma or chemical imbalance. He was not under the influence of any drugs, and he had no history of mental illness that could explain such a massive and coordinated fugue state. It was as if his very consciousness had been suppressed by an outside force. While his physical body was transported through a series of shadow places, the missing 411 researchers point to this as a classic and terrifying case of high strangeness. The actual physical distance between Whiteface Mountain and the city of Sacramento is approximately 2,900 miles of road. To drive that distance alone would take over 40 hours of continuous and high-speed travel, without a single moment for sleep or food. For a man dressed in full and conspicuous ski gear to navigate modern airports or busy bus stations without being noticed is a statistical and social impossibility. Yet, there he was, standing in the California sun with the dust of the Adirondacks still clinging to the soles of his boots, The mystery of the new iPhone remained one of the most haunting and persistent elements of the entire story. It was logged into a cloud account that he did not recognize and could not access, containing no personal photos and no messages that could explain its origin or its purpose. It was a sterile and frightening object. A piece of high technology provided to a man who had been stripped of his previous life and identity. Some suggest it was a tracking device, or perhaps a cold gift from whatever entity had snatched him from the side of the mountain. The haircut was equally disturbing in its clinical precision and its mundane nature. It was not the jagged or desperate work of a man cutting his own hair in a gas station mirror, but the clean and stylish lines of a professional barber who would take the time to cut the hair of a missing and amnesiac firefighter in a state of total confusion, and then send him on his way into the city. The implications suggest a level of human or perhaps non-human intervention that is far more terrifying than a simple and accidental disappearance. In the world of the unexplained and the truly fringe, there are persistent theories of portals and thin spots in the fabric of our three-dimensional dimension. These places are thought to act as doorways that open and close without warning or logic, pulling the unwary and the unlucky into a space between spaces. When they are finally spat back out into our world, they are often found in locations that make no physical sense, with physical changes that suggest a completely different flow of time. He was a victim of a massive spatial anomaly. A man who walked through a hidden door he did not see. The authorities eventually closed the case with a frustrated shrug because they had no crimes to prosecute and no logical explanations to offer the public. He returned to his life and his job, but he was a changed and hollowed man, haunted by the 6 days that had been stolen from his soul and his memory. He still cannot look at the silhouette of a mountain without wondering if the ground beneath his feet is truly solid, or if it is just a thin and fraying veil waiting to tear again. The missing 411 phenomenon is not just about those who stay lost forever, but about the ones who come back fundamentally wrong. We see this strange and impossible pattern repeated in the dark shadows of our own history. Take the famous case of Steven Kubacki back in the year 1978, who vanished while cross-country skiing alone near the shores of Lake Michigan. His skis and his poles were found neatly placed on the frozen ice, but his physical tracks simply ended at the water's edge as if he had been lifted away. 15 months later, he woke up in a grassy field in the state of Massachusetts, 700 miles away from where he started, wearing clothes that were not his own and having no memory of the intervening year of his life. These stories serve as a grim reminder that the map we use is not the actual territory, and that there are forces in the wilderness that do not follow our laws of physics. We build our sprawling cities and our paved roads, and we think we have finally conquered the wild places of the earth. But the wild is patient, and it is incredibly deep. It watches us from the tree line, and it waits in the oppressive silence of the high and lonely peaks, looking for the exact moment when we step away from the light and into the shadow. When you go into the woods this season, stay close to your friends and never, ever trust the silence of the trees. The air might suddenly turn cold and the birds might stop their singing, and you might find yourself walking toward a car that is no longer there in a world you no longer know. You might find yourself in a distant city you have never visited, with a new face and a new phone and a jagged hole in your life that can never be filled. The mountain is always watching from above, and the mountain never forgets a human face once it has seen it. Be very careful where you step in the high country, and be careful what you leave behind in the snow. The world is much larger and much stranger than we are ever led to believe in the safety of our homes. And some paths lead to dark places from which there is no easy or clean return. Keep your eyes fixed on the horizon, but always watch the shifting ground beneath your feet, because the very next step you take could be your last in this reality. Good night, and stay safe out there in the deep and growing dark.